Welcome again to the next video. The second video from the Prince will be on Chapter 3, concerning mixed principalities. It's titled France and the Start of Occupation due to King Louis XII's mentions in the later parts of it as an example. Now, for some context and why there's an image here, Niccolo Machiavelli was writing at a time right around the Italian Wars, which was a series of wars throughout Italy between many states. And this went from the late 1400s into the early 1500s, with a series of wars and campaigns which would sweep over Italy, often resulting in a massive amount of bloodshed and the rising influence of condottieri, or contract soldiers, basically mercenaries. Now, France's King Louis XII was a major player in these wars. His, I believe, father, Charles, also made some attempts on Italy, but Louis XII is the example used here. Now, to start with a quote from Machiavelli, "Men change their rulers willingly, hoping to better themselves, and this induces them to take up arms against him who rules. Afterwards, find by experience they have gone from bad to worse. These men, essentially, as he is describing, will, for reasons believing that they will gain, whatever it be, maybe they want land, maybe they want money, whatever the case, they will take up arms against those higher ranking than them in an attempt to grow their influence. However, they will often find that their situation has gone from bad to worse. Not only do they not get the promised spoils, because, simply put, there isn't enough, they also will find," and another quote, "you have enemies in all those whom you have injured in seizing that principality. That is the issue with new rulers, and why those men who will change their rulers and back the establishment of a new principality will find their situation getting worse, because they will be hated. If you were to, for example, go over into Bologna and try to carve out your own state there, great, you've somehow, let's say, succeeded. Okay? You now rule Bologna. Guess what? Everyone who previously ruled Bologna is going to hate you. All of their allies are going to hate you. And as you can see here, you're also going to get hated by the Pope. And, of course, the neighbors who happen to border Bologna aren't going to like it either. Basically, you are going to have a lot more problems because of your seizures. And, of course, war is expensive. Even coups cost a lot of money, meaning there isn't going to be as many rewards as can be divvied out to all the people who participate within a coup, revolt, or other usurpation of their previous rulers. So Machiavelli is essentially pointing out through these two quotes that a new state is naturally in a perilous position because you are willingly taking up arms, expending resources to take power, and those of you who participate will find themselves in a position where, put plainly, you don't have as much wealth as you used to, and everyone around you hates you. And, continuing from there, we get to France. For these reasons, Louis XII, King of France, quickly occupied Milan, and as quickly lost it. He marched in, attempted to seize the Duchy of Milan here, in what is called Lombardy, which is important to remember. This area, centered in Milan, is known as Lombardy. But Machiavelli also points out simultaneously that holding a place for the second time is far easier. This is because you know who betrayed you last time, who went against your rule, and thus, as a ruler, can take care of them with little complaints. After all, they have demonstrated disloyalty. And so, for these... Sorry, I had lost where I was. But to cause him to lose it a second time, it was necessary to bring the whole world against him, this being the King of France. Previously, it only took a local revolt and a few smaller Italian backers to kick the king out of Milan. However, In order to kick him out of Milan for a second time, Austria and several other kingdoms had to get involved. Technically, Austria was the seat of the Holy Roman Emperors, but that's besides the point. And, continuing, those dominions which, when acquired, added to an ancient state by him who acquires them, are either of the same country, culture essentially, and language, or they are not. When they are, it is easier to hold them. Essentially, and I do apologize if I spoke poorly when reading that, essentially means that a principality or territory is either of one's culture and language, or it is not. To give a simple example from, let's say, the 1860s, which you may not know as much about, but this is a fairly important historical event, so it's good to know anyways. The formation of Germany was not a simple matter. However, it went pretty smoothly, internally speaking. For example, after Prussia won its war with Austria and formed the North German Confederation, it annexed Hanover. Now, Hanover was a state that existed long before the Prussians, and, as a kingdom, existed in such a way since the 1810s with the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna. However, shortly after it was annexed into Prussia for siding with Austria, it was, well, rather smooth sailing. There wasn't as many revolts, or any major one that I can think of in the region, over their annexation, and they simultaneously were able to coexist quite well with the Prussians. This is because Hanover was a German state. They spoke a similar language, had a similar culture, and thus had connections. So the integration of the Hanoverian state, this new principality, in Machiavelli's views, into the older Prussian principality was smooth because they held the same country and culture. Culture and language. His example, Machiavelli's, was the integration of the many duchies in France as the French kings slowly consolidated their territories following the 100 Years' War. However, there is a separate possibility, that they are not of the same culture and language. Using Germany again, despite the fact that Alsace-Lorraine had many German speakers, it was not wholly German. It spoke a lot of French and had a very connected culture to the French. In fact, Alsace-Lorraine is rather mixed in that regard, so when it was taken by the Prussians in 1871 to form the German Empire, well, it created a lot of issues, and it was far harder to hold it. Not only because of the revanchism of the French state, but also because obstructionism, there we go, within Reichsland Alsace-Lorraine was making it more difficult to rule. Not as much so as, say, what we're going to get into with France and their occupation in Italy, but still, it definitely played a role. Quoting Machiavelli again, "But when states," I misspelled, so that's why there's a correction, "are acquired in a country differing in language, customs, or laws, there are difficulties." This is, as we've already gone over, because of that cultural difference. But it can also be seen in other ways. For example, when you had the intervention of Napoleon into Spain, sure, there was the obvious issue of just overthrowing the dynasty, but there was a bigger thing. The language, customs, and laws of the French under Napoleon were vastly different from the Spaniards. And so, when Napoleon overthrew the Spanish monarchy, and even though he did not directly occupy it, even just doing so, there were many difficulties in properly suppressing the Spaniards, because they didn't speak the same language, they didn't practice the same customs, and they didn't hold the same laws as the Spaniards. Sure, the Bourbon kings of Spain were not locals. That's just a reality. But they, at the very least, held and allowed the Spaniards to practice the same customs and laws that they already had, with reforms largely just to basically make the state profitable after it was suffering from the War of Spanish Succession. When France came in and basically overthrew their government, well, there were a lot of difficulties, even though it was an indirect rule rather than a direct annexation. And we see this again and again and again. If you look into the US, for example, and its expansion westward, sure, it could say it owned a bunch of land. It could even send settlers out there. But the individual Indian nations which ruled those territories did not take too kindly to it. The annexation of Texas was simple, relatively. Same with California. The people who ruled the republics were very easy to welcome into the fold. But the tribes, the nations that existed within those territories and throughout the West did not take too kindly. They fought, and they fought, constantly seeking to push back U.S. expansionism. They failed, but their attempts were what made it more difficult to occupy the West and basically made the U.S. government have to devote a lot of its time and effort to suppressing them, because otherwise it couldn't use the lands as it wanted, which was a very big issue for it. And Machiavelli would later advise how to handle such things. Now, he uses Rome as a positive example, but I will only include France for the negative example and go into the US to explain the positives. So, starting off, Machiavelli advises on how to secure such areas later on, specifically those without the same language, culture, and laws as the conquering place. He specifically gives the advice to 1. Reside in the new territory, 2. Establish colonies that are cheap enough not to drain the state's coffers, 3. Position themselves, the prince, as the protector of weaker states within the region, 4. Weaken stronger states or keep them from growing more powerful, 5. Not let an outside power gain influence or enter a region, and 6. Handle threats immediately. For his negative example, he uses Louis XII's Italian campaigns. Now, let's go down the list. Starting with 1, and we'll go with Louis XII first. Reside in the new territory. He generally treats this as the prince himself moving to the area. Modern states can't really do this as well, but they can still assign governors and other such people to handle it for them, so think of it like that. That is another way to effectively do so. What does Louis XII do? Well, at first he does not go there. He simply moves to take over Milan, working with a local power to do so. 2. Establish colonies. He did not do so. Lombardy was not settled by the French, nor were there any colonies or cities established specifically to make occupying Milan easier. Castles, to my knowledge, were not set up either as checkpoints or other ways to secure an area. Now, with the colonies in particular, whether it be Rome, the US, or whatever, it's important to note that you shouldn't drain your coffers to build. Sure, theoretically, the King of France could have just set up colonies all throughout Milan, all over Lombardy, rather. And would he have set up colonies? Yes. Would he have satisfied criteria number 2? No, because if you set up a lot of colonies and those colonies need defense, well, then now you're paying a lot of money, and that means either more taxes or you're going to suffer from other issues elsewhere. Essentially, you will bankrupt yourself in your attempts to control the region, and so the colonies will essentially end your occupation anyways. That's why he specifies that the colonies need to be cheap enough not to drain a state's coffers too much. It needs to be affordable enough that you can reasonably do so with light enough resistance that you don't have to spend so much on garrisons that you basically bankrupt yourself. We see this in Spain, actually, with their colonization of the Americas. But moving on to point number 3, positioning oneself as the protector of the weaker states. Now, France did attempt to do this, and many smaller states were willing to cooperate with France initially because they were powerful, and it would mean the Italian cities would have to worry less about the main powers within Italy. However, later actions, which I'll describe for point 4, made it so that they lost this advantage and functionally turned it into a failure. 4. Weaken stronger states or keep them from growing more powerful. Now, in order to enter Italy, the specific agreement for Milan was that Venice would invade Milan and take some territory from them, this area right here, if I'm remembering correctly, while Milan would fall to France. That was the effective agreement. Now, granted, the French didn't really have much territory in Italy in the first place, so they needed a way to get in, and this was their opportunity. So you can't really hold them against it too much. But their later actions would go directly against point number 4. To explain who the strongest states in Italy were, there were several influential states within northern and southern Italy. I'll go through them separately. In the north, the main influences were Florence, Venice, Milan, Savoy, and Genoa. Some to lesser extents like Genoa and Savoy, but they were the main players. Now, Genoa was a big trading city, Florence, center of the Renaissance, Venice, a lot of trade routes with the Ottomans. They all had their influence, but these were the main players that France either had to conquer, force, and sideline so that they didn't threaten them, or just otherwise make sure they didn't grow too powerful. In the south, meanwhile, there's the papacy, Naples, and Sicily, which was ruled by the kings of Aragon, who would later be incorporated into Spain. And so any actions within southern Italy would naturally have to concern these three in making sure they didn't get too powerful. Instead, the King of France went to aid the Pope. Now, admittedly, given the heavily Catholic nature of Europe at the time, specifically Western Europe, there was an argument for a PR move here. The issue is, when you're controlling Italy, or trying to occupy any amount of it, strengthening a stronger state is not advisable. And the Pope was one of the strongest rulers in Italy at the time. And so he is directly going against point number 4. He is actively strengthening a stronger state and going against keeping it from growing more powerful. This is what would destroy essentially his position as protector of the smaller Italian states. 5. The next point is to not let an outside power enter the region, if possible, or to otherwise sideline them from their affairs. The king, most notably, did not do this. In fact, in order to gain his claim to Naples, the King of France made a deal with the King of Spain regarding Sicily, where Sicily would go to Spain and Naples would go to France. This is actively inviting an outside power to challenge their influence, which was an issue and a bad call, as Machiavelli points out. And the 6th is to handle threats immediately. If there is a revolt or another issue, you handle it immediately before it spirals out of control. Now, Louis did eventually try to do this, however, because of how invested he was in many different parts of Italy, it would eventually fail and he would lose Milan, inevitably. Or at the very least, eventually. And so, because of his failures with the other 5 points, he was not in a position to effectively handle those threats as they came up. And thus, he was forced to abandon much of his campaign in Italy. Now, using the U.S. as an example and counterpoint, 1. To reside in the new territory, while the U.S. government did not directly move the capital to the frontiers, what it did do is establish local governments within the frontiers to effectively handle those new territories, which would have local leaders residing within the new territory who were friendly to the U.S., allowing for easier control. As for number 2, the establishment of colonies, much of the homesteading system that the U.S. relied on for settlement out west was effective colonization of the area. You would set up towns, dig roads, pave them rather, build trains, and you would set them up so that effectively your people, with your culture, your language, and your beliefs, were out there, and they would be willing to stay there, while the local people, who were, trying to keep you out, were effectively sidelined and outpopulated, unable to effectively resist, and were scattered. And because of how it operated, it was far more cheap to maintain. In fact, the US government would even profit off of this, because early on, they would sell the land for specie, or gold. Number 3, position yourself as protector of the weaker states. The US government did this a lot, especially with Indian tribes and their treaties. They would offer status of basically protectorates or other situations where they would guarantee Indian lands in exchange for the US basically being able to say, hey, we rule these other lands. Now, the US went against these quite heavily, the treaties, but they did follow number 3, and when it comes to Machiavellian logic, results are more important, so they did effectively engage in number 3. And the tribes did believe it, until they lost all their lands and it just collapsed in on itself for them. 4, weaken stronger states or keep them from growing more powerful. The US did this with Mexico, they did this with the British in Canada. Specifically, the Oregon Treaty would cut off Canada's expansion southward into the Oregon Territory, dividing it among themselves and the U.S. So Canada and the U.S. Furthermore, the Mexican-American War would kick out Mexico from the western frontier. Or at least part of it. You could argue at what point the West really is. But at the very least, from the modern United States, the Mexican-American War would kick them out, thus weakening them and ensuring the U.S. would have a greater hold over the region. The later purchase of Alaska would also remove Russia from the Americas, thus solidifying their influence. And, going along with this, 5, never let an outside power into the region. The US did this a lot, especially when it came to, more often than not, actually kicking out the outside powers, like Spain or the UK. For example, they would buy the Louisiana Territory from France, removing them as a player from the Americas, or at least North America. They would take over parts of the Mississippi, which were not directly controlled by France, specifically with regards to Spain, and would eventually take over Florida. They would even go so far as to, in the 1890s, kick Spain out of the Americas entirely, with the Spanish-American War. As mentioned, Russia was purchased out with the Alaska Purchase. The U.S. acquired the Panama Canal from France, and so would start construction, removing them from their influence there. And, of course, the elimination of the Confederacy meant that an outside power like Britain couldn't use it to integrate into the Americas and gain more influence. Not that the UK would want to directly occupy all that territory, as that would be expensive, but they would at the very least not have as strong a trading partner in the form of the Confederacy. And 6, the handling of threats immediately. The US, with its regional governments, would do this quite often. They would also be able to rapidly mobilize many forces to effectively suppress rebellions. Many of the Indian Wars were handled relatively quickly. Some lasted longer, but they still did their best to handle it. And of course, issues like who gets what lands and such were usually handled. Were there issues? Yes, and the Constitution, for example, was a necessary thing to achieve that. Otherwise, you just have wars between Pennsylvania and Connecticut again. But Essentially, the US did indeed do all 6 of those things, as did Rome, as did any successful conqueror. And, as pointed out by Machiavelli, you can't just avoid war completely. War can be delayed if you believe you can get a better position, sure, but war is going to come regardless. And so it's better not deferred to one's disadvantage. If you keep pushing something off and allow your enemy to gain the strength to surpass you, you are going to lose. So it is better to strike while the iron's hot and recognize when you are in the favorable position. Mixed principalities are fundamentally about the integration of the new into the old, taking your territories with your laws and your customs and your language and putting something new, potentially with different customs, different laws, and different languages into that system and having it properly function. This can fail very easily with just a single miscalculation. But it could also succeed. The Ottomans, through their conquests, were able to gain control of quite a lot of southern Europe. And they were also able to gain quite a lot of influence in the Mediterranean. Simultaneously, we see the Russians, with their expansion to the east, able to control much of the fur trade and even establish great power over the Central Asian steppe. Sorry about the blanking. But able to control much of the Central Asian steppe in the Great Game. The UK famously gained much control through all these methods, and it allowed them to dominate the diplomatic scene for much of their history. I mean, look at treaties of London and treaties of Paris. Those 2 places have signed many, many treaties. And that is largely down to the fact that the British would dominate the diplomatic scene, and France before them. Before the Pax Britannica, there was a big influence of France over medieval and Renaissance Europe. And so many treaties were signed in Paris. That's just how it is. Occupation is just a part of governance, one that we must consider. Even though we may like to argue that we're more advanced now, that does not change the fact that war may come. Indeed, in the US, you could argue, technically, we've already been there, and we're still there. Life is not pretty. Occupations, wars, integration, they are all things that any person who wishes to understand ruling must understand, lest they fail and the people suffer way more than otherwise. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a good one.